There you are. Are you with us, Dr. Newman?
Yep, I am with you guys. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you. Do you want to go ahead
Okay.
and start sharing your screen?
Yes. So let me share my screen and uh, yeah, just gotta get my PowerPoint.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I guess I gotta do this. All right. So can everyone see my can my PowerPoint be seen?
Right now, we're looking at your settings screen.
Oh, beautiful. Well, that's not good. Yeah, I know. I was trying to see this. Okay. Screen. Huh. It's not showing the PowerPoint.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting. Is it not showing it up as a screen that you can use at all?
Yeah, it's not showing up as a screen I can use at all.
If I may, you're able to share the actual monitor instead of a certain application. So you can do that, then just open the PowerPoint, and that should let you screen share it.
Oh, right here. Okay, I think. Is this it? I think it showed up.
Yep, that works.
Okay. All right. So, and I am going to. So I just started the slide. So thanks for everyone's help. I know sometimes I have some technical difficulties when I do this, so I appreciate everyone being here. I want to thank the Discord community and JW Rich in particular for inviting me to this. I hope everyone had a good Christmas holiday, nice New Year's. We're ready for 2024 and all of that good stuff. So we've had some interesting and enlightening conversations today on Austrian economics, and I really value the Discord community because it reminds me a lot of when I got into Austrian economics back in my day. Right, we had forums. Right, we had forums. We had to post and all this stuff. And anyway, Discord kind of brings me back to that. So I want to talk about a topic applied to Austrian economics. It's not specific on capital theory or Austrian business cycle theory or something like that, but it kind of deals more with government regulation. What you might say is a applied field of interest by Murray Rothbard, right, who is a very prominent Austrian economist. And this, of course, is the subject of what I like to call cronyism, right? So we hear this a lot as if we're interested in Austrian economics. We know that Austrian economics is a value-free science, but a lot of the conclusions of the effects of government intervention and so on and so forth, the consequences are that it harms society, it prevents people from realizing their desires and so on. But we hear that the traditional justification for government intervention, whether or not central banking or government infrastructure or so on, is that it benefits the public, right? Provides public benefits, they're public goods or whatever. The market can't provide these, so on and so forth. What I really want to argue is that Austrian economists, we could often say that, well, there are unintended consequences, and of course there are unintended consequences. We're not saying government officials are omniscient, but I do think that there's something in most instances of government intervention, whether it's socialism or, again, government infrastructure or monetary interventionism, it's really just instances of cronyism, right? And what I mean by cronyism is it's government intervention that benefits a special interest at the expense of the overall public, right? So a government might build some sort of infrastructure because some business or some group is lobbying for subsidies. Monetary intervention benefits banks and so on. And we can really go through the whole list, right? So when you look at government intervention through this way, and of course this is an empirical study, it's not a priori. You can't just say, oh, it has to be cronyism. You have to figure it out. You kind of get a much different picture. You get sort of the caste analysis that Murray Rothbard talks about, which he gets from John C. Calhoun. The taxpayers suffer at the expense of the tax consumers. And I think this is really what government intervention is in all of its various facets. It's basically just special interests lobbying for special privileges, right? So the task of the economic historian, and Mises did this to an extent, but really I think
Dr.
Murray
Newman, I
Rothbard-
hate to intrude, but it doesn't look like your slides are moving on the presentation side.
Oh,
You might have to go out of the... There we go. We can see it on the editing side like this, but it doesn't seem to be working on the presentation side. Sometimes it gets weird with sharing the screen and everything like that.
How embarrassing. All right,
it's
my
okay.
bad.
Don't worry, it happens.
Yeah, okay. I've got some pictures and stuff here, so the animations might not work well. But anyway, we'll keep going on. So hopefully everyone heard, I guess, just me kind of rambling on here for a little bit. And I was speaking about cronyism. So the task of the economic historian is to uncover the actual motivations behind legislation and to reveal sort of who really benefited. And I'm working on a book series that does exactly this. So I have a book that's already out. It's Cronyism, Liberty versus Power in Early America, 1607 to 1849. This book came out in 2021. And then I have a book manuscript that hopefully will come out at the end of this year. Cronyism, the Rise of the Corporatist State, 1849 to 1929. So I'm slowly approaching the modern era. And as I mentioned, I recently completed a draft of this manuscript. And the plan is hopefully to have the Mises Institute publish it at the end of the year. For those of you who are interested on a completely sort of unrelated book project, but it's a project on Murray Rothbard and his development as an economic theorist, the plan is also to have that come out by the end of the year. So sort of working on both of those. But the main project that I want to talk about is kind of Cronyism, Rise of the Corporatist State from 1849 to 1929. The cover will probably look something like the Cronyism cover. It's just to have a more modern fat guy, basically. Instead of someone who looks like Robert Morris with a bag of money, it'll probably be someone like J.P. Morgan or something like that. I don't know. So what's this presentation about? I could go through a general survey of cronyism in American history or concentrate in depth on specific examples. And I want to concentrate on a specific example of cronyism from my forthcoming book between the period of 1849 to 1929. And that's the history of the transcontinental railroads. So I'm sure many of you have heard this story before. I think it's important to kind of cover it as well as to repeatedly cover examples from economic history, because in order to really understand the present, we have to understand the past. And we have to understand the past better than, say, people on the opposing side, and that's just the way it works, unfortunately. So I picked the transcontinental railroads because I think it's a great instance of government, infrastructure, public works spending, and so on. How it basically ultimately gets picked up, carved up, whatever you want to say, by special interests, and really want to concentrate on these transcontinental railroads, right? So, to continue on, and I have a bunch of pictures and animations and stuff, and unfortunately, it doesn't seem like I'll be able to use that, but I'll maybe move some of these pictures around. I want to explain how the construction of the nation's transcontinental railroads were, one, inefficiently built because of government subsidies. And this is something Austrian economists argued frequently. It's that you can't operate, governments can't operate on a business basis. There are problems, built-in inefficiencies. You can't economically calculate as well. You're getting taxpayer money as opposed to the just operating solely through the profit and loss framework. This is an extremely crucial part of Austrian economics that I really think it's something that honestly needs to just be emphasized over and over again. I mean, that's why it just really takes lots of both theoretical, just going through the theoretical analysis as well as repeated empirical illustrations. Something else I want to talk about is how these transcontinental railroads enriched a small group of promoters, and then it kind of blew up in their faces. right? And we can see this through the so-called this headline, "The King of Frauds, How the Credit Mobile Bought Its Way Through Congress. Colossal Bribery. Congressmen who have robbed the people and who now support the national robber," right? So I want to get to that. What exactly am I talking about? I want to talk about how these guys right here ended up bringing about this, more or less, in so many words. So our story begins in the 1850s. If you've read something like Burton Folsom's The Myth of the Robber Barons, as well as stuff by Tom DiLorenzo and many other people, they talk about the transcontinental railroads in the 1860s and the Civil War. That's all great. I'll be getting into that. But really, the story begins in the 1850s. For those of you who don't know, which is probably most people, because most people aren't walking around with a map of what the United States looked like in 1850. This is what the United States looked like. Basically, east of the Mississippi River was all of the states, except for this big blob is Texas. And then there was this, basically the rest of it, unorganized territory. And after the Mexican War, Congress wanted to build a transcontinental railroad. They wanted to subsidize it with free land and government loans. The problem was it kept getting screwed up over the debate regarding the expansion of slavery in the Western territories. Would the railroad go through the free or the slave territories / the states? And this was quite naturally a North versus South issue. Slavery, really, when people talk about the slavery issue or the slavery debate, there's only a very small handful of people in the United States, growing, but still small, who actually wanted to free the slaves in the South. To the extent they wanted to do, they also just wanted to kick them out of the United States, unfortunately. The whole debate was over whether or not slavery should expand out west, right? And after the so-called Compromise of 1850, which kind of temporarily settles this slavery in the Western Territories issue, Congress bickers over who's going to get the Transcontinental Railroad. Is it going to be from Minnesota to Seattle? Is it going to be from somewhere in the Midwest to San Francisco? Is it going to be from somewhere from Texas to San Diego? Right? Each of these, wherever the government subsidizes, it's going to benefit a certain geographical region, right? And the Franklin Pierce administration Franklin Pierce was the president from 1853 to 1857. And initially, it appears as though the Pierce administration is going to favor the South. For those of you who know from a history class, the so-called Gadsden Purchase, which I have on this right side of the screen, that was a small sliver of territory purchased, our last, you could say, continental expansion of the continental United States, outside of course, Alaska and Hawaii. And it was explicitly intended for a railroad, which a railroad was later built there. So this is kind of worrying some of the people in the Midwest because, it looks as if the government's going to direct its subsidies to the South. Okay, so enter a man some of you might have heard of, Stephen Douglas. He was a Democrat from Illinois. He was chairman of the Senate Committee on the Territories. Right? Most of you probably know Stephen Douglas from these famous Lincoln-Douglas debates, both of them from Illinois, Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas. And Douglas is sort of forgotten because shortly after the start of the Civil War, he died, but he was one of the most prominent Democrats of the era. Something a lot of people don't know, and this is, of course, where the cronyism gets involved, is that this man who was chairman of the Senate Committee on the Territories was heavily involved in real estate speculation, particularly around Chicago. I'm not sure if anyone is from Chicago. If anyone is currently in Chicago right now, my condolences. I can only imagine how cold it is in early January. I've been there once in early January. Frightfully cold. But Douglas wants a central transcontinental railroad. And of course, why? Well, because he wants to boost the value of his real estate. This has actually been more or less uncovered by historians. He wants the eastern terminus near Chicago, which would increase the value of his land. And in order to do so, we go back here. All right, Chicago is in Illinois. To the west of Illinois is Iowa, right? That's a state. But to the west of Iowa is this big mass of unorganized territory, right? And in order to actually build a railroad Congress needs to formally create territories, which could then eventually, once the population is big enough, be turned into states. Right? So Douglas, in January of 1854, hastily introduces a bill organizing Kansas and Nebraska into territories. This is really why he sort of kind of quickly introduced this bill. And more importantly, once Southerners demanded that the states have popular sovereignty, aka that they are allowed to choose whether or not they want to have slavery, sort of in violation of the Missouri Compromise, Douglas quickly acquiesces. And historians have always wondered, why did he do this? Why did he create this huge conflagration in Congress? And the answer of some historians, which I buy, is that Douglas wanted to get the Transcontinental Railroad through the Midwest. He wanted to boost the value of his real estate. Of course, though, this doesn't happen. This leads to this big fight in Kansas and Nebraska, so to speak, and this kind of postpones the Transcontinental Railroad for a little bit until we get to the 1860 election, right? Central and Northern Railroad interests back a certain Abraham Lincoln, which I'm sure many of you know. He was a Republican from Illinois. And Lincoln was an attorney, a well-paid attorney, for the Illinois Central Railroad. The Illinois Central Railroad was a railroad that went north to south, basically from Chicago down. It was supposed to link up with some later infrastructure farther down south. Very prominent corporation, basically one of the biggest corporations in the United States at the time. And Lincoln was an attorney for them. The South was very against Lincoln for a variety of reasons. They were really more against the Republican Party than they were against Lincoln the man, but they still just did not trust Lincoln, and they said, well, see ya. We're peacing, right? So early in the Civil War, we kind of get to sort of the main action here. Republicans, they want to build a transcontinental railroad to connect Northern California to the interior. And why was this? Well, because California, which became a state after the Compromise of 1850, was potentially going to break up or secede from the Union or split up, with Southern California sticking with the Confederacy, Northern California kind of, either joining the Union or doing its own thing, or the whole state just doing its own thing. California was always very distant from the Union, kind of in the 1860s, and Republicans wanted to have some sort of infrastructure that would bind the coasts, right? When we speak of a transcontinental railroad, you think of a transcontinental, it's literally supposed to go across the continent from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. That's not entirely true. Strictly speaking, they all went from somewhere near the Mississippi River out to the Pacific coast. But anyway, there are these four Sacramento merchants. Leland Stanford. You might recognize his last name, Stanford. Yes, he is the founder of Stanford University. You've got Collis P. Huntington. You've got Mark Hopkins, and you've got Charles Crocker. They agree. They actually want to be in charge of creating this transcontinental railroad. Now, very important, and this is one of these inefficiencies that's kind of built into a lot of government intervention, is they want to make money not by owning the railroad, but by building it. Right? They basically want to inflate the costs, have the government foot the bill, and then just kind of let the railroad sort of, kind of meander, if you will, pun intended, so to speak. So the Central Pacific Railroad of California was chartered by the state of California in 1861. And what I just find so fascinating is that it's a little awkward because Stanford was simultaneously the governor of California and president of the railroad, right? So that's like the equivalent. It's like Gavin Newsom being like in charge of Apple, right? Or Google or something like some company in Silicon Valley. Right, because the Central Pacific Railroad of California was poised to be one of the largest corporations in the state, and for about 2 years, you've got Stanford. He was president of, he was governor, of California and president of the railroad. Right, so the Big Four, they dispatch lobbyists to Congress. They give about $66,000 of Central Pacific stock to congressmen. Now, as a side note, this is just something that's very important. because important to note, the smart way to bribe a politician is not to give them money, but it's to give them stock in your proposed corporation. Because politicians can take the money and they can leave, and they don't have to do anything to help you, or they're stuck with an asset that's value is going to go up if they give you the special privileges. So anyway, this is how the big four, they kind of get what they want. Another interesting point, Huntington was someone who was known to use seductive lobbyists, right? Which is a word from back in the day. And I just find that, so use your imagination, so to speak. So shortly thereafter, Congress decides that the Central Pacific was going to build from San Francisco, and they're going to link up with another railroad building eastward. And of course, what will that railroad be? So unfortunately, I've got some pictures here. So let me see if I can minimize these. The Kansas Pacific was a railroad that was lobbying to build east, to become the sort of the road that should be westward building transcontinental railroad. The problem is that just change that really here. I can do that right now. Kansas is too close to the Confederacy, so Kansas Pacific doesn't get it. Instead, financier Thomas Durant gets the job for the Union Pacific. He's going to build in Nebraska. And his whole racket, if you will, racket we think of as some sort of like illegal money-making enterprise, is to create a construction company that would expensively build the railroad at the taxpayer's expense. We could call this graft now. But basically, let's say you build a road. The construction company is going to say it costs $6 million to build a road. If it costs $6 million, then okay, great. But very often, it really would only cost like $2 million, right? So let me. Soon enough, the Union Pacific falls into the hands of Congressman Oakes Ames. Oakes Ames, a Republican from Massachusetts. He was on the House Pacific Railroad Committee, and he was the owner of Oliver Ames and Shovels. Just an interesting factoid. Because, of course, how do you make a railroad back then? You need shovels, right? So I wonder what company the Union Pacific bought shovels from. And even more damningly, his brother Oliver becomes the president of the Union Pacific. It's just a lot of sort of government inside knowledge that we don't actually really sort of hear discussed too much in most histories. But these are some, you might call blatant conflicts of interest, at least by modern standards. So the Pacific Railway Act of 1862, Central Pacific is going to build eastward from Sacramento, and the Union Pacific is going to build westward from a terminus to be cited by President Lincoln. Does Lincoln choose somewhere near Chicago? No. Lincoln chooses near Council Bluffs, Iowa. For those of you who don't know where Council Bluffs, Iowa is, basically right next to Omaha, Nebraska. For those of you who don't know where Omaha, Nebraska is, well, it's in Nebraska. To the west of Chicago, let's put it that way. And a lot of people have wondered, why did he do that? But again, something that historians bring up is that, Lincoln owned real estate near Council Bluffs. And again, you choose the location of a government project, and you buy up nearby infrastructure, you buy nearby land. And, in the modern era, we hear a lot about how, say, like Nancy Pelosi, whenever California is going to get a road or something like that, her husband invests in nearby land, things like that. It's par for the course. This has been always going on. Even our esteemed first president, George Washington, was in on the racket. So for every mile of track, the railroads would receive about 6,400 acres of free land, a subsidy, and as a land subsidy. And then the monetary subsidy was that the federal government issues bonds to construction companies to finance the construction. Basically, the federal government didn't want to raise the money itself. So it basically allowed the companies to use these bonds to sell to the public, and then they would be able to get the money first. The United States government was too busy involved in financing the war. They got $16,000 per mile over the plains, $48,000 per mile over the Rocky and Sierra Nevada mountains, and about $32,000 per mile in between. Okay. So it was actually quite a lot of assistance. In the end, the Union Pacific, when all the dust was settled after all the haggling and over the decades and all this stuff, the Union Pacific got about $27 million in government loans and 12 million acres. Okay, that's the size of New Hampshire and New Jersey combined, right? And of course, it's spread out over the country, but it's like a mini kingdom, basically. The Central Pacific got about $26 million in loans and 9 million acres. That was the size of Maryland. Okay, again, and another, it's a little kingdom. It's like a fiefdom, basically. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say the promoters profited like crime lords, because what happened is Oaks Ames and the Big Four. So Oaks Ames was in charge of the Union Pacific. The Big Four was in charge of the Central Pacific. They owned the construction companies that built the railroads, and they overcharged the railroads at the taxpayer expense, right? The Central Pacific had the contract and finance company, and the Union Pacific had the famous Credit Mobile. The returns were immense. The Credit Mobile increased the Union Pacific's construction cost by about 50%. That was about $11.1 million to $16.5 million. And if you own the stock during the construction, you earned about a 480% to 610%, basically like a 500% rate of return. That is phenomenal over like a period of 5 years. And Hoax Ames, as he was later known, which is, again, it's just great nicknames for people. Hoax Ames, that's phenomenal. Hoax Ames bribes other congressmen by selling them Credit Mobile stock with the incredible dividends paying off the purchase, right? So, now, something that's very important, and this is the Austrian insight, we might say, is that the taxpayer infusion, the assistance, the indirect assistance from the taxpayer, that is getting both government loans that would be paid back using tax revenue, and getting land grants that the government really didn't own. They just sort of declared ownership of the land. It kind of weakens the ability of the railroads to kind of engage in methodical or accurate profit and loss accounting, accountability. They hastily grade land thinking that, okay, this land is suitable for a railroad. It might not be. They're laying track on uncleared snow. There's improperly leveled road beds. Sometimes tunnels that they're blasting through mountains are too narrow for the actual railroad, the railroad train. And in Utah, where they were going to meet up, the Union Pacific and Central Pacific were actually building duplicate tracks. They were all just racing to kind of build more than the other railroad that they were supposed to connect up with to try to get more of the government money, right? And, there's a lot of stories of how privately built railroad, I was thinking about going into this, but I think I'll save some time for Q&A, by James J. Hill, was much more methodical and well built. Again, that's because it didn't rely on this massive government subsidy, right? So these construction companies are prospering while railroads dig deeper into debt with the government as well as with the banking system that they are taking loans out from, right? And again, this is sort of the illustration that the government spending is not only inefficient, this is the Austrian point, but it also is very often tied in with special interests, right? This is the Austrian point recognizes this, say, with Rothbard's welfare analysis, but it really comes more from the historian kind of uncovering the motivations engaging in that type of work, right? So they connected in Promontory Point in Utah. For anyone who saw the movie Wild Wild West with Will Smith, there was a brief scene where Ulysses S. Grant was sort of hammering in connecting the railroad, and then this giant mechanical spider appeared. It's not entirely what happened, minus the spider, but, they did connect. And they say, look at this, we built this successful railroad that stretched from Omaha to Sacramento. And of course, in reality, the combined railroad is basically only 2/3 done. And that's because the railroad is so poorly built, it needed to be repaired. So congressmen just kind of ignored that. But yeah, it wasn't this massive success that we think it is. So let me see. So let me just, I want to give some time here. Could go into a little bit on the Northern Pacific, which was supposed to build basically from Minnesota to Seattle. That is sort of, it got started later through the 1864 Pacific Railway Act. But by 1869, the Union Pacific and Central Pacific are, quote, completed, only like 2/3 completed. But what's interesting is that the tide sort of starts to turn against the transcontinental railroads. And that's because there's sort of a public revulsion against them. I think this is a great quote between two members of the Big Four, from Mark Hopkins to Collis B. Huntington. He says, quote, "When we commenced 11 years ago, Congress and legislation were gentle steeds. Bless me how they rear and tear now," right? The idea is that it's getting a lot harder for them to bribe congressmen, right? And this very often happens with cronyism. Other special interests take over and so on. So I have, again, some pictures I have to sort of move here. So if the crime movie that we're looking at is everything's good from, say, 1862 to 1869, then this is sort of the part of the movie where things start to go downhill, right? Tony Montana, he starts to gets arrested. He starts doing too many drugs, all the cocaine, right? It starts to get to him. The big thing was in 1872. This is the famous Credit Mobile scandal, which basically revealed that congressmen knew that the railroad was the transcontinental was inefficiently constructed. They were just paid to look the other way. This looked especially bad because at the time the railroads were trying to avoid paying back their government loans. Oaks Ames, he got the name Hoax Ames at this time. Again, that's a great name. So the Union Pacific was totally tarnished in the eyes of the public. And why I have this giant inferno here, the fire, is because the Big Four saved themselves. They simply torched the contract and finance company's books, which honestly, that's a business practice. If you're going to go to jail, then just honestly burn the evidence. That's one way of looking at it. So they do that, and that's kind of a funny sort of they kind of survive. And we can think about the glory days of the transcontinentals. They're over. Their strength in Congress has been greatly reduced. There's no more land and monetary subsidies. And then Congress passes another law basically forcing the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific to pay off their loans. They have to divert 25% of their net earnings into a fund. And this kind of poses a bigger problem, because then this prevents them from using that money to compete with, say, newer railroads. Instead, it gets sucked back into the taxpayer. So there's sort of a double whammy here. First, the government misdirects funds into building these railroads, and then they're requiring these railroads to pay them back. And that leads to sort of a further misallocation of resources. So I could go on, as I mentioned, into a bit about James J. Hill's Great Northern Railroad, but I think I'll end here. And again, I kind of had I had all my pictures here. But so the story of the transcontinental railroads is kind of like a crime epic, right? Part one's the rise and the raking in of the money, right? You think of Tony Montana, he's making all of this money. For those of you who've seen Scarface, it's poorly built on the taxpayer dime. Resources are malinvested, etc. Then there's part two, the bitter fighting and the feuds. The famous scene from Scarface where Tony's yelling into a telephone that's not even connected anymore. He's way too high on cocaine. And then part three is everything falls apart and the feds take over. You've got Credit Mobile and the Thurman Act, and this is, of course, Tony Montana lying in a pool of his own blood. Now, obviously, this does not happen to the owners of the transcontinental railroads, or more accurately, the companies, but a somewhat similar story where cronyism is, in many ways, you get the sugar high of the government rewards, and then it, more often than not, it kind of backfires on you. But at the end of the day, there's a misallocation of resources, a malinvestment, and so on. So I think with here, I know I've gotten until about 4, so I want to leave some time for Q&A. So I think I will end. Thank you so much for staying awake through my presentation. I look forward to your questions.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. I'll go ahead and kick off the questions here by asking about there's been a lot of discussion and discourse recently because of different political events about the Civil War, and specifically causes about the Civil War. There was a clip of Nikki Haley that went viral where she was talking about it, and there's been lots of discussion and so on and so forth. And I think one thing that a lot of this discourse has really done is to help highlight the importance of a lot of historical revisionism, and specifically the revisionism of the kind that Murray Rothbard is famous for, but then also other figures like Ralph Raico and even yourself. So what are some areas you think could really benefit from this kind of perspective that maybe haven't received it yet?
Yeah, so the causes of the Civil War, that's of course it's a controversial perspective. I mean, a controversial subject. Yeah, there was the Nikki Haley thing. I mean, so just to check, that was part 1 of the question, right?
Right. The question was at the end there is that what do you think are some good areas that could receive some more attention from Austrian-inspired historical revisionism that maybe haven't received it yet?
Yeah. So yeah. All right. So without getting into the Civil War, I mean, I think I've sort of been trying to go methodically, almost like the island hopping in the United States in World War II in the Pacific Theater, like sort of moving like brick by brick. At least that's my nefarious kind of plan to sort of try to cover as much as I can of the American history through through this kind of narrative structure. But there's a ton of perspective. I still can't cover everything because then it would just be this reference book. There's a lot of stuff that could be done on, for example, say intellectual property. I know someone had brought that up. David Brady had once asked me this. He's a student at Florida Southern College, sort of about intellectual property and cronyism. I think that's a great example. I do think there's a lot of stuff about with other countries that could be done. I really think that there's a story everywhere, and it really just kind of boils down into how far you look. You have to read a lot, and then you have to read some more. And I'm kind of now starting to get in. I've been doing some research, writing some papers on sort of post World War II cronyism in preparation sort of for the 3rd book, and even something like the Marshall Plan is crony. There was this guy named Will Clayton who was assistant Secretary of State. And he was basically the one who pushed for the Marshall Plan, and of course he owned this major cotton exporting firm. All sorts of stuff that you could really sort of get into a whole analysis. I mean, I think everything could benefit from this type of perspective, down to modern day policy, which I hope to get to. Does that answer the question?
Yes, it does. Thank you. Yeah. We had a question here. Let me scroll up. Okay, here it is. So the question is, do you think that the abolitionist movement developed between 1820 and 1870 later on caused the progressive era? Were there any ideological similarities between those two?
Yeah, definitely were linked. So yeah, the abolitionist movement, I kind of talk a little bit about this in the first cronyism book. It really, you could say, starts to take off in the United States in the early 1830s. There always was, in a sense, up to the Quakers, like Benjamin Franklin, genuine abolitionists who thought slavery was morally wrong. And in the 30s and especially in 40s, it kind of picked up steam. People who thought that slavery was morally wrong, again, not necessarily concerned about the welfare of the slaves, but this all had to deal with post-millennial pietism, and it was the idea that in order to bring about the kingdom of God on earth, you had to stamp out sin, right? So you had to you had to stamp out sin, and that could involve, say, slavery was a sin, and that of course also involved later on after slavery, the abolitionists, they kind of move into prohibition, right? Or they move into making sure that we're Christianizing the Catholics. so to speak, because they've got the Roman popery and all of this stuff, and yeah, many of the those postmillennial pietists were very influential in the progressive era. They became a bit more secularized, right? So less of a, say, explicitly religious motivation, but they still had that same fiery evangelical zeal, if you will. But there absolutely was a link between, say, the abolitionists of the 1850s and then the abolitionists of the, not technically not abolitionists, I'm sorry, but then the sort of the prohibitionists of the 1870s, 1880s, and then the later progressives of the early 1900s.
All right, we'll do one last question here for you before we let you go, and that is, the presentation that you've given here is, I guess, a little bit depressing, talking about the cronyism of the past and even some of the cronyism that still persists into the future. But in spite of all that, are you optimistic for the future?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, I think. I mean, it depends on how you view how you look at optimism, but I do think. Look, at least over the past several decades, hundreds of years, standards of living have gone up. So I don't think we're ever going to hit an era, a period in which you're going to see that, that massive, say, stagnation compared to, say, like the World War I or the Great Depression or World War II. I think there's going to be bumps. I think there's going to be periods of relative stagnation, but there is a lot to look forward to, at least things like massive technological innovations of artificial intelligence or things related to medicine. I think, of course, if the government gets out of the way, there's going to be the greatest chance of that actually leading to human prosperity and not leading to some sort of like Terminator revolution or something like that. But I am optimistic. I think it's just, I think Paul Swick mentioned this at the end of his talk. It's kind of long run optimism. I think one of the most important things Austrians can do is to not always get so tied up in the short term kind of current event cycle, or thinking that, scoring some easy points against the opposition or something like that. I mean, it's the long run battle for ideas. It's the roundabout production processes, if you will. Those are the ones that are the most productive, right? Or the most productive ones are the roundabout ones. And, it's just, sort of that long run trend. I would say I'm optimistic of the future.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us here tonight. Is there anything you want to plug, and where can all the people here find you at?
Yeah. So one, thanks so much, everyone, for listening and to hearing me kind of drone on. I greatly appreciate it. And I would say I'm on Twitter, at Dr. Patrick Newman. The first Cronyism book can be found online for free. It can also be found on Amazon. Valentine's Day is coming up, so it's a great gift to buy. And of course, the next Cronyism book will be able to be purchased on Amazon and Mises, as well as The Making of a Misesian Economist, which is the sort of the story of Murray Rothbard's writing Man, Economy, and State. So just thanks again.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for being here.